In 2010, I spent almost 9 months preaching through the book of Deuteronomy for a crew on Saturday nights, and ever since that project ended, Penny Digg has been harassing me to finish Deuteronomy. So here we go. Moses and the second generation of Israelites have arrived at the edge of the land as Deuteronomy opens. And what Deuteronomy is an offering of a series of Moses' final words and final instructions before he dies, and the Israelites are left to take the land. And we're told in a sort of summary verse in verse 5, chapter 1, verse 5, that Moses has set out to explain the law to the second generation of Israelites. Deuteronomy opens with Moses giving an extensive, multi-chapter historical recap. As someone in our small group last week said, it felt like I was rereading Numbers, which, if you're in a small group, you had just read 3 times. But this isn't just a play-by-play of what we read in Numbers, because it includes some details from Numbers and it leaves others out. It includes a few additional explanations of events. It emphasizes certain events, certain experiences, and at the same time, it then minimizes other ones. This morning and through much of Deuteronomy, we are going to be dealing with people who are thinking about and who are responding to their history. A lot of bad Christianity has come from thinking wrongly about our past, or thinking about our past in bad ways. Deuteronomy attempts to train us in the discipline of good and faithful history, of good and faithful retellings of our past. And it'll be important to say just a few things about how we do history and how we are to then tell our stories before we take a look at our passage here. So I want to get started with this question. Have you ever asked 2 different people about the same event and they give you such different answers that it's almost impossible to imagine that they were talking about the same event? You ever had that experience before? What?
Luke and John.
There you go. It's not, as the saying goes, there are 2 sides to every story. This isn't about sides. It's about stories. And it turns out there are an endless number of stories that can be told about any given event, depending on where you stand and how you look at the event. And so this is how we engage our pasts. We craft stories based on events that happened. These stories attempt to make sense in some way of what has happened to us, and this is what we call history. History is the discipline of interpreting the past by narrating it. And we do this all the time. And so I want someone to help me out. Tom. This is really painless, I promise. Tell me about your day yesterday, and keep it short. Oh, the handheld. There we go.
I went for a bike ride, and then I went and saw the Great Divorce in San Jose last night.
Okay. Went for a bike ride, went and saw the Great Divorce yesterday. Did you drink any water yesterday?
I drank a lot of water while I was riding my bike, yes.
This might be too personal. Did you use the restroom at all yesterday?
Probably, yes.
Did you breathe yesterday?
Yes.
Okay. Why didn't you include any of those in your telling of what yesterday was?
You said keep it short.
Heyo!
That's probably me.
We are done with streakies, hopefully.
Blaming it on his laugh.
Right, we can agree that including those kinds of things would make for a more factually accurate portrayal of his whole day. As I say, tell me about your day, those would add to it by providing factual nuggets. But Tom left them out because I created a context for him, short, that forced him to evaluate the events of his day and craft a very short narrative that included 2 events that helped us know something about his day. And he rightly determined that those other details would probably have been uninteresting to us, or that in an overall summary are inconsequential to helping us get a gist of what his day was like and what it was all about. Tom, what about thinking? Did you do any of that yesterday?
A lot.
Okay.
Well, the great divorce.
Exactly.
During and after. It continues even now.
What about feeling? Did you feel anything yesterday?
Absolutely.
Were those thoughts and feelings important to you as you look back at yesterday?
Absolutely.
But you didn't include any of those in your account. He shakes his head no, right? One reason for that is that kind of internal sharing about our internal lives, also demands context, right? We tend to share those things not in large group settings, but in more intimate, smaller spaces, small groups and families, and among close friends. The important thing to see here is that for whatever reasons Tom had, he edited himself. That's a tricky word to say for me for some reason. He edited himself. And so we heard a summary history of yesterday in Tom's life. Thanks for your help. I hope you can see the point that I'm trying to make. History is told whenever someone narrates the past in any way. And history is always an edited account. And it is always edited for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we just forget details that are inconsequential. Even if I gave Tom more time to speak, he probably wasn't going to talk about the water that he drank and the number of times that he breathed, because they are inconsequential. Sometimes an event happens so quickly and so unexpectedly that we miss details. This is often one of the issues when we talk about eyewitnesses in some sort of criminal event. Sometimes we have a point to make in what we're sharing, and so we emphasize certain parts of the story. And sometimes, to limit our personal embarrassment, we exclude certain parts of stories, right? Think about history as it relates to testimonies. In the church, testimonies are often the stories that we tell about coming to faith. A few years ago, it was popular to teach people to share their faith using like a 3-question outline. What was your life like before? How did you come to faith? And what has your life been like since? You can see how those 3 questions edit and shape the history that gets told, right? Again, this doesn't mean that the story that gets told isn't factual. We've just selected which events, moments, and experiences in a lifetime of events, moments, and experiences we think are most important and helpful to convey the message that we were lost, have been found, and are now are experiencing new life. Consider this as you think about your own story. If you've grown up in faith over time, you probably tell your testimony differently than you did 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 25 years ago. When I first began to follow Jesus at the end of high school, my testimony was pretty critical of my years growing up in church as a kid. I would say things like, how could they not tell me what I needed to know? They clearly had missed the point and were off, and it was their fault for some reason that it took me this long to know the truth. Well, after several years, I began to rethink this narration of my story, of my past, because I had begun to learn more about just how we learn. I was doing a lot of reading about how children and youth develop physically, emotionally, spiritually, and I read a lot about the importance of rituals and routines in the life of children. On top of that, I discovered that when people are nearing the end of their lives and have dementia or Alzheimer's, it's often the songs and the prayers and the scriptures that were memorized as a child that are the very last memories to go. And so as I engaged with all of this data, I started to examine my early years as a Christian. Because what I began to see was how formative my childhood in the church had been for me, although I would never have professed faith up until that time. Having the Apostles' Creed that we sang at the very beginning of service memorized, I came to faith with a sort of outline to our faith that helped me make sense of my reading of Scripture. Having the Lord's Prayer memorized provided me a template, a starting point for my prayer life. Having a dozen hymns or so memorized and a couple other contemporary songs, I had a foundation for what it meant to offer to God worship. Having had a pastor who, as a kid, met with me when my parents were getting divorced, and having had several adults who showed interest in me at various points, I had a strong sense as I was coming to faith that the church was a community of care. So when I accepted Jesus' invitation to follow him as a 17-year-old, it wasn't that I was hearing the message for the very first time. It wasn't that what I had seen and experienced and heard in church as a kid was somehow insufficient. I had spent several years blaming that church, and it wasn't the church's fault. It had been my fault. I was the one who wasn't interested at all at any point in the journey. I was the one who was closed to it. I was aloof. I was hard-hearted. In fact, I had been, when I started to actually remember, I was the one I had been bored, just as bored with the Bible and with Jesus in the first year that I went to Young Life as I ever was in the church. And so, as I look back on it, it was somewhere in the overlap between this extensive experience I had in the church as a kid, the circumstances of my life in high school, and the ministry of Young Life, that I began to respond to the Spirit of God as he invited me to be open to the love of God that's demonstrated through his Son, Jesus. Somewhere in the overlap of those elements, those parts of my life. It's important to note this. When I tell my testimony in a different way 10 years later, it's not that I'm just willy-nilly changing what happened. One of three things could be happening. One, I could be showing that I have a better understanding of what's happened to me. With more time and reflection over the years, with the insight of others around me, and mostly with the influence of the scriptures, we all become better able to describe our faith journey, right? A great example of this is John Wesley's A Plain Account of Christian Perfection. It's a short book. It's sitting on the bookshelf in the lobby. In it, Wesley narrates his history with the doctrine of entire sanctification or Christian perfection. And in this book, what he does is he identifies several early experiences that he had. And he talks about how over time he grew in his understanding of what God was doing, of what God might have been doing in those experiences, and then he re-describes them later on with new and maybe more biblical language. Socially, we see this kind of thing often, this growth in perspective when it comes to presidents or movements in our society, right? In the middle of a presidency, it's difficult to know the long-term effects. With time and new data, we're better able to evaluate a president. And this is where we get the cliche, time will tell, right? Over time, we'll be able to tell what this all means. So my testimony could have changed because of an understanding, because my understanding grew in some way. Or I could be changing the story in an untruthful way in order to extend an agenda. This is one of the ways in which our stories change over time. Some of you guys may know the name David Barton. He's pretty well known for trying to make the case that the United States was more Christian in its founding than it really was. And while some evangelicals have looked to him as a credible historian, in 2012, his Christian publishing company pulled his book on Thomas Jefferson. And a senior vice president with the publisher said this: there were historical details, matters of fact, not matters of opinion, that just were not supported at all in his work. And there was a lot to that, but when you hear people talk about revisionist history, this is the kind of thing that's often being described. Someone comes along and offers false facts or intentionally withholds or suppresses crucial facts in order to re-narrate an alternative interpretation of history that supports some sort of agenda. I wish I could say that I've never heard someone share a testimony that was factually inaccurate, but maybe it's something about our culture where the big, flashy, emotional testimony is celebrated as maybe more compelling to God's love and salvation, that I've heard people actually describe events that never happened to them, but they took from somebody else's life and appropriated to themselves as part of their testimony. There's a temptation to do this. So if a testimony changes, and it's not from a growing understanding of the past, and it's not from an ill attempt to revise history, is there a third option? There is indeed. If I were to tell you to give a 3-minute version of your story, of your testimony, you would be required to contextualize it. You are deciding what the most important elements for this audience is. If I asked you to come and to speak to a group of addicts, you will emphasize the place of addiction in your journey. If I asked you to come and speak to a group of married couples, you would come and you would emphasize the place of marriage in your journey. If I asked you to come to a conference and to speak about the Holy Spirit, you would emphasize the work of the Holy Spirit and your understanding of the Spirit as you share your story. And as you emphasize certain details, time constraints mean that you will be required to leave out other details. You wouldn't be deceptively leaving out facts. You wouldn't be changing what happened. You would be contextualizing your story because in a limited amount of time and with the task of highlighting certain elements, you have to. We have a great biblical example of this in Paul. He tells his story 3 different times in the book of Acts. And he tells pieces of it with various elements in several of his letters. And it's enlightening to read each of these accounts and see how Paul adapts his story to each of these new contexts in light of the present purpose that he faces. Turning then to Deuteronomy and to Moses, retelling their history, it is clear that Moses offers us an edited version of what we find in Numbers. Because Numbers covers history that takes up 26 chapters, and Deuteronomy does it in 3. Why does Moses tell this history? And it's difficult for us to know for sure if Moses has grown in understanding, if Deuteronomy is the result of, added years and new wisdom. It's not too far from the realm of imagination to see a guy has gained some perspective over 40 years. In terms of maliciously changing history, we could test Moses' narration by looking at the account that we have in Numbers, and we can compare Moses' later telling to the earlier one. Are there, in Moses' story or re-narration in Deuteronomy, are there unsubstantiated inaccuracies? Are there substantial changes that cannot be explained? Are there omissions that fundamentally change the story being told? I think Moses holds up under this kind of scrutiny, which leaves us then with a contextualized account. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 5 says, Moses undertook to explain this law, saying. To explain this law. Moses begins to tell the story of the Israelites' journey from Mount Sinai to the edge of the Promised Land. And in the process of telling the story, Moses includes some events while leaving others out. Moses is crafting a particular kind of history that will resonate with his audience and provoke them to action, provoke them to faithfulness. And the way that Moses does this is impressive. He spends almost the first third of this retelling emphasizing the first generation's failures. We're going to jump kind of to a few verses. He looks at the first generation's failures, starting in chapter 1, verse 6. The Lord our God said to us in Horeb, "You have stayed long enough at this mountain. Turn and take your journey and go to the hill country of the Amorites." Jump to verse 19. Then we set out from Horeb. Horeb is another word for Sinai, and went through all that great and terrifying wilderness that you saw on the way to the hill country of the Amorites. So we get what happened. They were told to leave. Here, they have now set out, and arriving at the hill country of the Amorites on the edge of the land, the Israelites sent spies into the land. And so we keep reading in verse 25. And the spies took in their hands some of the fruit of the land and brought it down to us and brought us word again and said, "It is a good land that the Lord our God is giving us." Yet you would not go up, but rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. I think it is safe to say that Moses has a point to make to the second generation that's sitting on the cusp of the land. Your parents refused to go into the land. You have a chance. You have the chance now to create a new way for yourself and for this new generation and for the generations that will follow you. And so as he tells the story, he includes specific details about the kind of people that the first generation was made up of. In verse 9, Moses describes these people as a burden, so great a burden that he himself, the great leader of the Israelites, cannot bear them alone. In verse 27, Moses describes the Israelites as murmurers, complainers, griping about Moses and God from the privacy of their own tents. In verse 31, Moses says that in spite of God's loving care for the Israelites through the wilderness, they continue to refuse to trust God. They do not trust him fundamentally. Then in verse 41, Moses reminds them about when God gave them a consequence, saying, "You must stay in the wilderness now because you've refused to come into the land." And the Israelites, they reject God's discipline. First they reject his promise, and then they reject his discipline, trying to do what the Lord has now told them not to do. These are some of the characteristics of the first generation. In other words, Moses gives them an extensive critical review of this first generation in order to say, here, you are now in the exact same situation. Will you respond any differently? And in the understatement of all understatements, Moses then sums up what follows. So a whole 38 years in the wilderness this way. Turn to chapter 1, verse 46. So you remained at Kadesh many days. That means 38 years. The days that you remained there. Then we turned and journeyed into the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea, as the Lord told me. And for many days we traveled around Mount Seir, until the Lord said to me, "You have been traveling around this mountain country long enough." Amen. So what is the story that Moses is telling in these 3 chapters? We get a whole chapter for the trip from Sinai to the land to highlight and emphasize the failures of the previous generation. Then we get 2 verses that sum up 38 years. And then the next 2 chapters to follow detail Israel's, the second generation's most recent journey from the wilderness, the camp that they had in the wilderness, to the plains of Moab east of the Jordan, where they are now set up. So you get a couple of months, 38 years, a couple of months. In chapter 3, verse 21, we're given a pretty explicit explanation for what Moses has been up to. And he says this, "And I commanded Joshua at that time, 'Your eyes have seen all that the Lord your God has done to these 2 kings. So will the Lord do to all the kingdoms into which you are crossing. You shall not fear them, for it is the Lord your God who fights for you.'" It is essential for the second generation of Israelites to know how their parents fell short. If they are to learn from those mistakes and move forward faithfully. But in terms of sheer words, it is far more important that this generation remember what God has been busy doing for them in their midst since they started moving toward the land. You have seen all that the Lord has done. You shall not fear, for it's the Lord your God who fights for you. As we conclude this morning, I want to consider our own history as a church in light of these two categories. A few years ago, during the 1.5-year interim season that we had, we dropped down into the 40s in weekly attendance. And as church observers in our country know, it's incredibly rare for a church that once had over 100 that drops below 50 to not die. That historically speaking, this is the case. There is a life cycle to churches. As we read the New Testament, every church that we find in the New Testament is no longer there. The church, God's people in the world continue to exist, but local congregations have a sort of life cycle. This church, by every measure, and we had done several church health surveys, etc., was markedly on its way toward death. If we looked at our past, we could honestly say that we had refused to do what God had called his church to do, which was make disciples. We had put consistently unrealistic expectations and burden on a single leader. We had been grumblers and complainers. We had tried quick fixes at various points and tried to do other things that created the illusion that we were trusting God, but was really just a continuation of our disobedience. We were dying in the wilderness. And for whatever reason, God seemed to not yet be finished with us. And a couple years ago, within just weeks of each other, I remember when John and Carrie, when Brian and Allie, Robert and Joan, Jay and Sajan, David and Whitney, Kyle and Lindsay, kind of all found their way among us right about the same time, and in a really profound way, brought to this congregation a fresh breath of the Spirit. There was a sense in which this group of people wanted to join up with us, and that together we might have a future seeking God and serving him and being what God has called us to be. Within a few months, there was this renewed sense of purpose and of God's commitment to us as a congregation. And since then, we could tell a number of stories. We could tell the story of changed life after changed life. Many of those changes, not dramatic and flashy, but subtle and there. We could tell the story of people who've grown to love hearing from God in his word. We could tell the story of people who have found healing through friendship and love shown to them by saints in our congregation. We could tell the story of people who were once without homes, friends of ours in the community breakfast, who now are living in relative comfort in a home because a saint in our congregation walked with this person and helped them get on their feet. Story after story, we could speak of all of the things that God has been doing among us and through us. Even in just recent weeks, we could tell these kinds of stories. So think about the first 3 chapters of Deuteronomy. What are the sins of the previous generation? And what is God doing among us even now? How do we critique our past? And how do we see God's present faithfulness? The introduction to Deuteronomy trains us to ask these kinds of questions. And this is training that we need. Because if you will listen, what you'll hear at the edges are that things were so good in the past, but now maybe they're not. The critique is of the present, and it isn't measured. And the positive spin is on the past that doesn't exist. In other words, remember how great the glory days were. Why aren't things like that now? But Deuteronomy flips the script. Because if we are to find success in what God has called us to do, make disciples, walking faithfully with God, Deuteronomy calls us to learn from the past, learn from the mistakes of the past. We must faithfully evaluate those who have gone before us. And we cannot romanticize and we cannot villainize. We just have to honestly evaluate. And if we are to live in the present, walking faithfully with our God as he is here with us now and compelling us to be his servants in the world, we have to have eyes to see where God is at work among us here and now. And God is at work among us. One of the ways that we try week after week to remind ourselves of our connection to the past, of God's faithfulness and his call to constantly be reflecting on our faithfulness and giving thanks for his faithfulness is when we come to the table. We are reminded that it is the faithfulness of Jesus that brings us into relationship with God. It's not based on our faithfulness, but it's the faithfulness of Jesus that has made it possible for his Spirit to come and to make up his residence in us. And so as we come to the table and we receive the bread and the cup, we're reminded of the lengths to which God would go to help us become his faithful people in the world, to be his church, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, a light to the world, salt of the earth, ambassadors of God's kingdom.